Community TV show, and today I am here with Jason Weber. Jason, you're the Marin County
Marin County Fire Chief. Yes, sir.
And
I'm Mark Brown. I'm the Deputy Fire Chief for the County of Marin.
Awesome.
And I'm Christie Neill, Battalion Chief for Marin County Fire.
Give me a little background of this year, particularly, maybe for California in general, but how it involved Marin County particularly. Were you?
Certainly.
Yeah.
So Marin County Fire Department is one of 6 contract counties in the state of California, and what that means is CAL FIRE pays us for like services to protect what they call the state responsibility area here in Marin County. In addition to that, we also have an agreement with the National Park Service to provide wildland fire protection on their lands, predominantly southern side of the county and the coast. And we do participate to a great deal in the state mutual aid system and assistance by hire. So we find ourselves on fires throughout the entire state, supporting, our partner agencies that are struggling, like Paradise, Butte County, Napa County, Sonoma County, in the events. And I'd say, you asked about this last year, and I was speaking with someone today, and I said, well, this has been a 4-year fire siege that really hasn't ended, and we've had some small breaks. January, February, March-ish, but really that entire time is spent getting ready for the next summer. And I think that, I think at the beginning of this 4 years we called it new normal, and I think at this point we have to stop calling it new normal and realize this is reality for California, this is reality for Marin County, and we need to adjust to that.
That's interesting. You were saying new normal 4 years ago? That's when this is, it was already at that point, what was building was kept reaching previous records, I suppose, or intensities that you hadn't been experienced.
Yeah, and the significant drought that we were in and over those several years put us in this position at a statewide level. And I think it stressed our fuels out, and everyone's focused, a lot focused on the Sierras, Southern Sierras, and the tree mortality. But you look at Marin County, and 20 years ago, we were, ground zero of sudden oak death. And we have a lot of dead and down material in our forests because of climate change, and then a prolonged drought. Our forests are stressed. And you asked a little bit about, fire control, and there hasn't been a lot of natural fire to clear that dead and down material. We have, pitch canker out on the coast and the seashore presents some substantial challenges where we're seeing massive tree mortality in the Bishop Pine Forest. So we have a lot of issues here in this county.
What is the Bishop Pine Forest? Is that out here in West Marin?
Yeah, so it's out on the Park Service land, really the scar of the 1995 Mount Vision fire, which was about 12,000 acres. The Bishop Pine came back so thick, it created an unhealthy and unsustainable forest, and we've seen probably a mortality rate that's got to be pushing 40 to 50% at this point.
Of the Bishop Pines themselves?
Bishop Pines.
From the beetle or from?
From the pitch cane. Well, what it is they're so thick, they've stressed each other out, and then you have this pitch canker that comes in after that is creating some of the mortality, and Christie can certainly probably speak to it better than I, but it's one of that a chaparral species that has a lot of dead and down material, especially up on the Tam watershed, and then to the sudden oak death problem. And we've seen, if you drive around, you see oak trees, dead and or dying or on the ground.
And pine trees too? They not necessarily, so obviously it would be a different disease or an issue, but I have seen pines out in West Marin. It seems like maybe Doug firs. I'm not sure which is the species, but that are.
Well, pines have a healthy lifespan of about 40 to 50 years. So if you think back 40 to 50 years ago when there's a lot of planting for cover or whatever it was on people's property, those are starting to reach the end of their useful life, and they are susceptible to drought and other things. They're, and in many cases they're not native to the environment they've been planted in.
Let's go back to you guys being sort of like the bench players on a team ready to go in at a moment's notice. Maybe that's not even a fair, because it's more like you're a regular members of the team. I actually apparently prepared and ready to go at the first call or need when the first big fire comes out. How many firefighters in Marin County generally would be out at a time, and what is the current size of the roster in Marin County for the fire departments?
So when you talk about the departments collectively, you know, there's 16 agencies in Marin. Marin County Fire having that core wildland fire responsibility under contract with the state. We have about 90 full-time personnel, and we flex to about an additional 90, so 180 personnel during the summer to meet that mission between our fire crews and additional staffing on our engines. And then the other agencies, you know, have their regular routine staffing, and they will call people back into backfill. But maybe Mark can talk a little bit about, you know, when the bell goes off, whether it be a fire in Butte County or a fire here in this county, what kind of response are we going to have? And our initial attack success rate here in this county is very high. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we are, you know, well resourced, especially on the 101 corridor. And when you start to see fires that escape that 10 acres or less, it's out in more rural areas where response times are longer. So we know that the closer fire trucks staffed are to an incident, the higher the success rate we have in keeping the fire small. But I'll let Mark talk a little bit about what a standard response here in the county looks like, and then how we support the Master Mutual Aid System and assistance by hire across the state.
And so for the responses in Marin, we really do try to use as much science and fact behind building our response models. So every day, multiple times during the day, we take weather readings, and the weather includes the temperature, the wind, the humidity, but we're also measuring the fuels that are available to burn. And that creates what we call a burn index. And the burn index goes on a scale, and depending on where it lands on that scale, that determines whether our dispatch level will be low, medium, or high. During the wildland fire season, 90% of our responses are what we call a medium dispatch. So at a minimum, in a fire in Marin County Fire Department's jurisdiction, you get a battalion chief, 4 wildland fire engines, a bulldozer, 1 water tender, 2 crews, and then from CAL FIRE, we're going to get what we call an air tac, so that's the plane that's spotting for the rest of the aircraft, 2 tankers, 1 copter.
This is based on what size has to trigger this?
This would be what's called a medium dispatch level, so a burn index of between 21 and 40, and the numbers are relative. But about 90% of the time,
size fire.
Any size fire, from initial report of a fire, hey, I see a small fire, that's what we're going to send to it, because every fire that got as big as they ever did started out as a small fire. So we treat every fire with the worst case potential.
Wow. And are you getting notified almost simultaneously? Let's say it's something that's spotted in Napa, for instance, and somebody calls it in. There's smoke on this hillside, whatever. It's going through the Napa Fire Department first? Are they triggering the signal to you guys? Or?
So for the areas that are outside of the our response areas, on the CAL FIRE side of it, we participate just for the Marin County Fire Department's dispatch center is on an intercom where all the resource orders are being placed. So we will start hearing about initial dispatches immediately. But during the wildland fire season, we all are very in tune with what the fire situation is throughout the state, and we're monitoring other people's radio frequencies. There's intelligence websites that we'll go to, and we'll actually know about fires really early in the process, whether it's online scanners or intel websites that people are saying, hey, there's a fire here, this is what it's doing, and we stay in tune with that. And if it's a neighbor, such as Napa or Sonoma County is a perfect example during the October firestorms, we'll actually place a call. Hey, just so you know, we have these resources available for you if you need them. And then if they request them, we'll send them. And sometimes we'll start, if it's something catastrophic like the October fires, we started pushing resources that way before they even requested them.
Yeah, wow.
But I think it's important for people to realize that no matter what we send out of the county, we're not stripping the county. The California Fire Mutual Aid System is very dependent on everybody. There is no one agency that can handle all the fires. Right. So helping your neighbor is vital. However, we all know that we're going to hold a little bit back to protect our own.
Naturally,
so we have what we call a drawdown policy, and it's based on how many pieces of equipment we still have in county, how many personnel we still have that are available to be on duty. And if we hit this line, then we're not going to exceed that line because we still have to protect our county.
Naturally, yeah. Now, on the cruise, you said there were 90 overall fire persons?
Firefighters.
Firefighters. Perfect. That makes perfect sense. Firefighters. Was it 90 was the number?
That's our full-time personnel. Then we flex with 90 additional seasonal firefighters. Right. So an engine company is going to have a minimum of 3 people on the engine. Some of the engines will have 4. Then we also have fire crews, and the fire crews are the people that show up with the hand tools. Instead of a hose and water squirting it, they're going to use chainsaws and hand tools to remove the fuel from the fire area. Wow. So a fire crew will range between 12 and 20 people.
That's impressive. In the course of, well, maybe we should jump back to we could jump back to the Irving Fire. Let's do that. Let's touch base with this local event that took place back in was it the end of August? I've already lost track. September. And right near my neighborhood, where I live on Arroyo Road.
There you go.
Oh.
So,
yeah, you're familiar
first-hand experience.
So let me ask you this before we go there: did you participate? Did you have an opportunity to participate in the evacuation drill that we did?
Well, you know, I have to confess that I did not. It was an incredible, powerful event to witness. I lived a little bit on the close edge to Sir Francis Drake of Arroyo Road, and so initially, when I'm trying to remember the sequence of events because it's very interesting. I was just coming back from Point Reyes when the first fire engine raced in the other direction past me as I was turning onto Arroyo Road. And within a half hour, maybe 40 minutes, you know, I could smell the smoke. I come down and people say, yeah, there's a fire up on Mount Barnaby. And so at that point, I walked down to the end of the road. And that was about the same time that police and fire trucks were starting to come up, at least in my memory, up Arroyo Road and station themselves or trying to get, actually, come to think of it, maybe you guys were already up there at that point in time.
Probably.
I think.
So the background to the Irving Fire was it was late in the evening, so it was after what we call cutoff time for aircraft. So aircraft weren't available because they don't fly at night. And our fire lookout was getting ready to end his day. And he was closing up the lookout, and he walked out, and he saw the smoke. So he made the first report on the smoke, and he was placing it near the area of the Irving campground, which is right up against Sir Francis Drake. So there was some question whether it was going to be best accessible through the campground or accessible up through the top of Barnaby near the lookout. So the first arriving battalion chief, and so that was a medium dispatch day like I talked about. So we had a battalion chief, 4 fire engines, 2 fire crews, a bulldozer, and a water tender responding to the incident. And he made a call very early in the response to send some resources to the bottom up and come up through Irving Fire Road. And he sent other resources up to the top so that we can get around it and corral it. It was in a fairly inaccessible area, so it took some time to get people into it. And looking at the way the smoke developed, it looked like the fire was probably up against some heavy fuels. It burned in the grass, got up into some stuff that it really wasn't burning aggressively, and then finally got up high enough on the slope to get into the wind and made a hard run towards Lagunitas and Forest Knolls. And that's what prompted the evacuations with an abundance of caution. And it was it's interesting, one of the areas that we did an evacuation drill during the summer, earlier in the summer, is the exact area that we issued evacuation warnings and orders. We felt that the community was well prepared for it. The feedback we got was mostly positive. And we partnered with Marin County Sheriff's Office. We were side by side with them the entire time. They were managing the evacuations while we managed the firefight.
Yeah, I've heard from friends who went down to the evacuation center and had nothing but good things to speak about the communication that was there available to them, letting them know what was going on. And for me, I heard the notice of an evacuation, but I heard it sort of as it didn't come. No one came to our doors. I heard it up above, And I came down to my place and threw my valuables in my car. But then curiosity got me, and I walked back up Arroyo Road again and had this little vantage point near the intersection. You could look up at the hill there, and it seemed like there was a fortunate turn of the wind maybe at some relatively, I won't say early in the evening, but well before midnight. Would that be correct?
Yeah, the winds did decrease, and the fire, quite honestly, got up into a position on the slope that wasn't as exposed to the wind. So the rates of spread that we saw when it was up high and in the wind dropped dramatically once it got slower on the slope. But you know, sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but
you're fine.
this is a perfect opportunity to talk about Alert Marin.
Okay.
You were talking about notifications. What we really need to do is push that word out for Alert Marin. If you go to alertmarin.org and you can register your cell phones, register your home, register your email, and then that is the information that we use to push out the evacuation notifications.
Wow.
When we talk about evacuations, you know, we do them in a systematic way intentionally for those obviously closest and have the greatest risk first, and then start to work backwards from there. And the reason is, and we've seen it with a lot of these larger scale fires, is we put everybody on the roads at the same moment. Sometimes we end up clogging up the roads for no reason, and those, you know, closest and most affected now can't get out as quickly. So we're very systematic in our approach. We work with the sheriff's office very closely, as well as the county OES, sheriff OES. And we have evacuation maps for our first responders that have areas with primary and secondary routes, and they're pre-identified with messaging that can go out. And other counties are looking at our county as an example of some of the work that forward thinking and essentially planning that's been done, so we can do things faster and more organized. And but the key is this is a partnership with our community, and people have to be registered in the system. There's not one, you know, they shouldn't have a false sense of security just registering for Alert Marin. They also need to be at a heightened level of awareness. You know, September, October are our greatest risks here in this county. Now, November, that we seem not to get rain, and that's when we have our east wind events, and that's when we've seen the greatest fire progression historically in the county. And, you know, for those, especially our seniors, those with access and functional needs, they need to have a plan with neighbors or friends for notifications. We'll never be able to do this just law and fire. It has to be something where we have partnerships in our community. San Geronimo's a great example of an engaged community. The community center opened up immediately for us. We were able to send a captain down there to provide some information to the public that was there. And then, you know, typically with the evacuation, what you'll find is we may do an immediate evacuation order, which is they must get out now. And then, as you saw later in that evening, we extended a warning, which probably included you, at Arroyo. And that is just so we're giving people notice ahead of time that we may turn this into a mandatory evacuation order and lift it from a warning. And we want to give people plenty of time. So I would encourage individuals, if they're not comfortable staying during that warning period, to leave then and not wait. And certainly not try to hold their own ground and stay at a house, because they end up becoming a rescue for us, and we're taking resources from extinguishing the fire to now rescuing people, and we never get a chance to actually put the fire out because we're just trying to get people out. So the evacuation piece is something that the community has to partner with us on.
And Jason talked about those with access and functional needs, and for those that know it's going to be a difficult time for them to evacuate, and we get into some critical fire weather, which is, you know, 10 to 15 days a year that we're putting out the red flag notices. If they're in one of those areas that's under red flag and they have access and functional needs, that might be a good night for them just to go ahead and visit with their family members and maybe spend the night outside of the fire risk area, because they know that they aren't going to be able to evacuate quickly.
Well, there have been stories about people staying behind and saving their own homes. So when it comes down to the mandatory evacuation policy, are you going to handle it maybe on a case by case, or is it something that, I know that obviously, just as you spoke, if it, you know, it could easily turn into something where you are no longer able to do your job because somebody is at their house. is there a level where a bold or foolish human being can sign off on their legal rights and say, or whatever, and say, this is my house, you know, whatever.
They can, and you know,
By law, they don't have to.
by law, they're not required to, but it certainly isn't advisable, and I think it's somewhat selfish in a lot of ways because now we're taking, you know, an engine company where I've got a captain and 2 seasonal firefighters, and these kids may be 18, 19 years old, just starting their life, and now they're putting themselves in extreme peril to save this individual that decided to say. It's also that's taking our resources away from other people that we could be protecting structures. So in some ways it's selfish, but in California, it's, you know, we can't forcefully remove them. And I would just encourage people, and some people think they can survive this. You know, the 88 plus individuals in Paradise, I think, would probably tell you different. So, I made a bold comment one time at a public meeting when I was disagreeing with a member of the public who said they wanted to go to their basement, and you know, finally got to the point. I said, then make sure somebody's got your dental records. And you know, we can't. We'll risk a lot to save a lot, but people can't expect that they can stay and withstand these, especially the way we're seeing this fire activity and fire behavior.
I don't think anybody should think that or expect that, or as a matter of fact, they should probably put a skull and, you know, some sort of mark on my house saying, you know.
There's lots of things that the public can do to improve the ability for their structure to survive a fire, defensible space, hardening, getting the roofs cleaned off, having your vents screened, dual pane windows, removing vegetation up against your structure. So there's lots of things that we can do to increase the ability for the structure to survive. And so where you live, you've probably had a few defensible space inspections by the department.
I actually am not a homeowner, so I don't have to quite get the brunt of that. But I do know for a fact that yes, there have been tours in the summer already with guys with a notepad to every neighbor, I believe, on the street. And you know, it seems like something also that I was thinking of. Why don't you just go ahead and explain this Fire Safe, because it seems to be, is this an organization that you play a role in, Christie?
So let's talk a little bit about the defensible space inspections. In our department, hire seasonal defensible space inspectors in the summer to go and work with residents on what they need to do to make their homes survivable from wildfire. And so that's the defensible space inspection. There's also lots of information about evacuations, how to prepare, and be ready, be more prepared on the firesafemarin.org's website. And so evacuation checklists, there's brochures about creating defensible space, about reducing pyrophytic plants and replacing them with plants that are not so flammable, and things to harden your structure so that it increases its chances of surviving a wildfire. So Fire Safe Marin is our local Fire Safe Council. It's a county-wide organization, a nonprofit that has a board of 16 members made up of a variety of people representing the community and public agencies. And so we have lots of information there for residents to go and get. We have monthly meetings that are open to the public to improve people's awareness about being prepared. So there's lots of resources out there that folks can access to help them be prepared. And so we also, a couple years ago, prepared a countywide community wildfire protection plan. That's that large 170-page document you looked at. So what we did with that document was we used best available science. We basically brought together all the fire departments, land management agencies, and other stakeholders together to kind of work together and figure out what our priorities should be in Marin County. Part of that effort also involved mapping all the vegetation and identifying where our fire hazards were the greatest. We also modeled fire behavior across the entire county and ranked the entire county with high, medium, low, and very high fire hazard and risk. And so those maps in that document help us identify where we can prioritize our work to reduce fire hazards as a county, as a community. So there's lots of information in there, and that helps the agencies develop their programs of work on how to work with communities and protecting natural resources and reduce fire hazards.
Is there, and I'm just thinking for the is there a fine line between a person's landscaping and overgrown brush? Because I feel I can see what overgrown brush looks like pretty clearly, but at this point, anyways, in Marin County, our people need to be concerned that they might their cherished little, stand of blackberries or whatever it could be told to disappear, or what?
There are definitely some more flammable vegetation types that we'd like to see residents remove, especially in that immediate first 30 feet around their house. Junipers are really bad, super flammable. Pampas grass. There's a variety of some of even the older rosemary is very woody and actually pretty flammable. So we like to see people get that reduced around their property, limb up their trees, keep everything well maintained, cut their weeds, make sure their gutters are cleaned out. Your house is most vulnerable, the roof is the most vulnerable piece of your house from the ember shower. And so making sure the gutters are cleaned out, leaves, needles, all that stuff is super, super important. In addition to looking at larger pieces of property, your driveways, your access, making sure that we can get fire equipment in up your driveways, that they're clearly marked, they're wide enough, the trees and limbs and bushes are cut back. We have big equipment, and us getting in and trying to get the people out is sometimes challenging in Marin, just due to the narrow roads and the amount of vegetation. So we really need homeowners to help us in making sure that their properties, their driveways, their piece of the road is cut back and cleared out so that we can get in and they can get out.
You had started to ask a question about, I think, the FireWise communities, and Christie and her team certainly deserves a lot of credit, and that I believe just recently we have crested and become the #1 county in California for the number of FireWise communities, and at the rate we're going, we could be #1 in the nation and take California to #1 position.
So this FireWise community.
FireWise USA is a program sponsored by the National Fire Protection Agency, NFPA, and so there's a process in which homeowners, neighborhoods can get together and work together as a community to make their neighborhoods more resilient to wildfires, and go through a variety of education processes and working together as a neighborhood to make their community more fire safe, or at least FireWise. So there's lots of information again on the firesafemarin.org's website on how to become a FireWise site. It requires a community to establish a 3-person board at a minimum. The fire department will work with the community on doing a fire assessment, and then and that's a documented assessment. They also have to come up with an implementation plan of some action items that they might want to accomplish to increase the fire defensibility of their neighborhood. You pull all those things together and you go through an application process, and then annually you work as a neighborhood to work on events being education, vegetation removal. You can have chipper days. You can do a variety of things to work as a neighborhood.
Sounds good.
To make your
and it's the neighborhood in control, right?
Absolutely.
It's a neighborhood.
Absolutely.
That's good.
It requires community involvement. It requires individuals to take action, but it also requires individuals to work with their neighbors to take action. And that's the only way this is all going to work, is if individuals are working with their communities and their communities are working with the fire departments.
Well, it sounds good as long as they're all
we'll get there.
Really polite people when they go knocking on somebody else's door.
Guy, you mentioned, or Christie had mentioned, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, which the Board of Supervisors adopted in 2016, which was a comprehensive document that really gave us a scientific approach to how we strategize fuel reduction work and where our greatest risks and threats are in the county. And subsequently, after the 2017 fire siege in the North Bay, the board had put together a working group to develop a lessons learned document. And I think there's about 70 takeaways from that document here that we're working towards in the county. And I think some of the highlights are, it's a collaborative effort between all the fire agencies. People often ask, why are there so many fire departments in Marin? I said, well, there are probably more than we necessarily need from different agency perspective, but we operate as one collectively on an operational basis and are working, and we're completely in step on how we can better prepare Marin. I think everybody recognizes, including our elected officials, that we have the work to do in this arena. And this document is certainly one of the blueprints we're using to move things forward. And that's everything from changing some of the codes we have here in this county and really focusing on the house out concept, where we want that first 3 to 5 feet really to be non-flammable, and then that, as Christie mentioned, that 30 feet is so important.
Give me a brief overview of the departmental overlapping and/or does the Marin County Fire Department, which you are the chief of, does that embrace all of the local fire districts or communities, or is it sort of a separate, how does that work?
No, so most of the cities have their own fire agency,
right,
or there's a fire district that lays over the top of that city and then those unincorporated areas. So predominantly we cover Marin City up and over the mountain and down the coast and back around towards Petaluma. And then there are different fire agencies, fire districts that cover other unincorporated areas. We do have the responsibility for wildland fire protection in the state responsibility areas. So that's pretty much anywhere there's watershed, and it may be a fire district that overlays those unincorporated areas, but by virtue of being SRA, it can't be in a city. But irregardless of who's responsible, when the bell goes off, we respond as one. And I think that's the important message for the public, is that jurisdictional boundaries, fire does not, certainly doesn't care what jurisdictional boundary it is, and the fire service doesn't. We're going to send a response that is best suited no matter whose jurisdiction it's on.
Is that, all right, the jurisdictional district could be a different chief, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And is there a potential, am I looking to find things wrong where maybe they could be just fine, but is there a point where people will defer if there is a jurisdictional issue, if there's two different opinions on how best to, move with any event? Does that
so
any
the system in California is really good because the individual that brings a checkbook to pay for the fire ultimately has to say how things are going to go. But the relationship we have as fire agencies in this county, it's never a jurisdictional beef, if you will. It's always what's best for the constituency we serve. And if at the end of the day somebody has to pay for something, we'll work that out. But we're not going to not order something that we need because of a jurisdictional boundary.
Oh, I see.
And we enter into what we call unified command. So if we send a chief, because it's in the SRA or threatening the SRA and it's in another fire district or a city, they just are in step immediately. They work together and assist each other.
Well, let me get clear on that money event then. Are some of the fire districts actually not directly in that funnel of finances backing up? Is that it?
So there's three primary land types here in Marin. Local responsibility area, which is your cities and towns, and they have a fiduciary responsibility for fire protection in their towns. Then there's the state responsibility area, and when we respond, we wear the state's hat for them. And essentially we're expending state funds as they've told us to do in our contract. And then they would take the fiduciary responsibility for that fire. And then there's FRA, which is federal responsibility area. So for us, that's mostly National Park Service lands. And in the case of having a fire on their lands, they would ultimately be the ones that not only have the say, but are also funding that firefight.
Okay.
And resources are never held back due to any opinion of an agency's ability to finance it.
Mm.
The resources go,
Right, right,
period.
exactly. Is it just, I mean, it's not, there's not even a beam counter in the pipeline,
No.
right? It's, is that
On the
correct?
decision point, there
Right.
was eventually when they started to
Well-
become bigger incidents, and you
Okay.
talked a little bit about
Yeah.
the Sobranos fire and the
Right.
cost in that report.
Let's
that
touch
came
base
out
on that.
recently.
And was there lessons learned in the general department? There must have been discussions, particularly maybe in this last week, but maybe it's been before this, that you've seen some other reports. So there was this fire. This was the Big Sur fire of a year ago,
2016.
A couple of years now.
2016, which, according to a recent newspaper article, and there is an organization that I just should mention their name. You probably heard of them. I'm not sure what influence. Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. Have you heard of these guys yet? Or?
Not until the report came out.
All right, and this came out this week. It's interesting, and I mean, I don't think any of you guys are going to argue with safety, ethics, or ecology. I mean, that's part of.
Well, even the cost piece. I mean, we have
Yeah.
a responsibility to, use taxpayers' money in the most efficient manner possible. But we also have to weigh that against protecting people's homes
Right.
and their lives. And I think that's where you see some conflict in this report is the decisions made on the ground, and Mark was the operations chief on that fire, were in the best interest of saving homes and ultimately saving people's lives. And where you start to see conflict, I think, with especially the federal firefighting agencies and the cost of this is how much money are we putting into suppressing fires in open lands? And this is certainly a conversation we're having in the greater fire service. And the challenge we have in California is that these aren't open lands. They're intermixed with homes, infrastructure, and we have to find balance there. So maybe Mark can speak to a little
Mark.
bit of the
So,
report.
Very
like Jason said, I
fascinating.
was the operations section chief for that fire for 28 days.
Wow.
So, and there are constructive criticism is always welcome. And when people take a look at what we're doing and say, hey, you know what did you think about this? Did you think about that? That's always appreciated. But some of the things surrounding Sobranos fire was, it didn't start in the vast wildlands. It started near communities, and it was burning homes in that first 12 hours.
Right, but then it moved.
Well, it was
further-
burning well into on the fifth day of the fire. It was still burning homes, and then we had a large amount of equipment on that fire, and every day we were using, and then some, all the equipment that we had on the fire, and we still had the entire Carmel Valley threatened by the fire. And I had someone looking over my shoulder for giving me some eyes, looking for holes in my strategy. And he actually came up to me and said, hey, Mark, every day you're using every piece of equipment you have available for this fire, and you still have all of Carmel Valley threatened. And it burned 3 miles in one day. Carmel Valley is less than 3 miles from your fire perimeter now. So if that fire runs towards Carmel Valley, are you going to be able to defend it?
What was the time period for you? This sounds incredibly dramatic and what an experience. When the fire started, were you within days, or because I know the fire extended for quite a
I was
time.
there within the first 12 hours.
And did you become the
I was-
operations chief?
The next morning, I became the operations section chief. So,
Wow.
so I was intimately involved in the decision making, and so once we got the fire away from most of the structures, and the report talks about that the large volume of personnel stayed high after the fire got away from the structures. It's not exactly true, but it did stay higher than you would for a lot of the wilderness fires. But the key, or the decision making for that, was that there were some natural barriers that we were making a hard push to keep the fire from pushing past those natural barriers. So that we
The
didn't
fire was heading inland, correct? Heading away from the ocean, heading east.
Yes, and heading actually more south than anything else.
And was it tending to head toward into more wild and less inhabited space?
It was,
National forest
into
land.
the national forest land, and our goal was we kept a high force on it to get it into the areas where we knew that once the fire got in there, it was going to be a 2-month-long fire. So we expended an enormous amount of resources to keep it from getting into that area. because not only are you going to be spending money for 2 months, once it gets in those areas, you're going to have firefighters in very dangerous terrain fighting fire for 2 months. So
was there any? I'm not familiar with. I haven't looked at a map and the geography. Was this one of these options where if it did continue to burn, it would not be? It was not actually threatening communities or any large houses, so you could let it.
It was
burn
early
out?
enough in the fire season that you could not just let it burn, because it could skunk around and not burn aggressively for a week or two, and then you would have a bad weather event come, and next thing you know, you're now threatening that next community down. So waiting for what is termed a season-ending event was really not an option on that fire.
It's got to be then, I would imagine, very difficult place to get for it to be an option in California. Am I correct?
Or is very few areas.
When you talk a little bit about you're wearing a Smokey the Bear hat, we said, that's I think Christie came in and said that's been part of the problem is that we've had an aggressive approach to stopping all fires, and so what was very natural in the 1800s certainly and before, and even in this county, our Native Americans used fire to help clear land. We had a very natural landscape with grassy oak woodlands, some timber probably on the higher elevations, the north sides, but a healthy forest. And when we started intermixing homes into all this, we lost the ability to have that natural reoccurring fire event. And that's presented some challenges, certainly. And I think not only here in Marin, but across the entire state, is that we have fuel buildup now that's 100 plus years old. And when that starts to burn in and around the houses, it would certainly be nice to manage it. But you're talking about now those same resources that they're talking about in this report being extended, 30, 60 days beyond, and they have to be available for initial attack and new fires. And we're using a lot of local government resources that were never designed to be out all summer long fighting fires. Those resources are really for cities and towns to have for their general protection. And it's putting a burden on a lot of the firefighters who are being asked to work a lot of overtime to backfill just so we can be out there on these devastating events that we're seeing year after year.
Let me just throw in an idea from out in it's not even in left field, it's to get back into Fallon, but this is an idea that maybe I read or maybe I just came up with it myself. What do you think about, and I bet maybe somebody has thought about this, like a checkerboard. I mean, it'd probably horribly ugly from outer space, but if you had like maybe a half-mile stretch for every 5 or 10 miles of forest land, you kind of cut down to something where, like a close shave, and give you, and then you could let things like a square just burn. We don't have the option necessarily of natural fire or even in some cases controlled fire in and around these communities, but what we can do is start to reduce the fuels mechanically or manually. And in 2005-ish, the Board of Supervisors approved the creation of the TAM Fire Crew, which was a 12-person crew that was going out and doing just that, critical fuel reduction projects in our most critical areas.
Bridge tops and roads
and around communities.
Areas.
And last year, the partnership with the National Park Service allowed us to expand that. And the park recognized the need to do work in and around the park, around the communities that they border. Really, I see this as the future opportunity here. We're challenged with hiring contractors a lot of times in this county because sometimes it's cost, but even just availability. And so, I think expanding the crew programs is going to be something we certainly are looking at in the future. And as one of the lessons learned is we have to reduce this fuel, and it's going to require a lot of manpower to do that.
And we aren't doing it through just creating moonscapes. We're doing more shaded fuel breaks, thinning the vegetation, removing what we call the ladder fuel so that the grass isn't burning into the brush that burns into the trees.
I see that we're naturally running out of time here. There's a couple of things I want to touch base on before time disappears. One was the story by of just this past week of California Fire Chief Ken Pimlott, Have you met? You guys know
Yeah,
Ken?
okay.
And
We'll be at his retirement dinner next month.
oh, wonderful. All right. So, anyways, he was interviewed by an Associated Press reporter, Department of Forestry and Fire Protection Director Ken Pimlott, and I just yellowed out one thing at the top. He says after 30 years, firefighter says we need to think differently. Now, what's your thinking of what makes it different? What do you think needs to be done?
Well, to the point that Jason talked about us being the new norm started, quote, the new norm started in 2015, four years ago, 4 fire seasons ago, and we're past that new norm. And the paradigm of how we prepare our communities for fire has to change. And then the paradigm of how we combat these fires has to change. We are putting firefighters at more risk than we've ever put firefighters. We're putting firefighters on the line for longer than we ever have. And a good portion, or a good reason of that is where we've started building homes. And we're building homes further and further into the wildland. And we're building homes in the areas that we used to always let burn. California is designed to burn. Its ecology is driven by fire. And now we're putting homes where we used to always let the fires burn.
Let's put a name on it. I mean, how could you get more irony than this devastating loss by calling it paradise and having it burned down? It seems to me, like you've read the stories, I'm sure, and know a little bit of the history. Apparently Paradise was a relatively small population only like maybe 30 years ago. And although I saw a story in the LA Times about it, rose from like, I think 7,000 population. Maybe it's about the same as the California, since 1970, but 7,000 to 27,000, I guess, all with 2 small roads going, from what I understand. And that, I think, is what your fire chief was saying, that the headline says, Fire Chief, state must consider ban on homes in fire-prone areas. Now that's a big thing, because you're telling people, like, no, you can't build your house here. But then I get to the next story, which was in Los Angeles, this housing development for 19,000 units, not somebody wanting to build a house on his lot, but 19,000. And did you read a little bit about this area that it could be
and I
for
think
Philly?
this is California's struggle. We are, we have a need for additional housing, and that we're built out in our urban areas and even the suburban areas. And Marin is an example of where you had little summer cabins in Mill Valley on these roads that were designed for horse and buggy, and now we have 3,000 to 5,000 square foot homes in place of those cabins, with 6 to 8 cars if they have kids at each house, and the same roads that they used horse and buggy on. And that's certainly, this built environment presents some challenge from a fire protection standpoint. I think as Chief Pimlott is exiting, it's easier for him to have some of these conversations and bold discussions.
It's great that
and we do have to look at, and I think that in a lot of ways our codes that we've adopted locally are with access and egress needs. We're not allowing people to build homes where we can't get to them. There's no water supply. As Christie mentioned, they're not hardened. Right. So we have to take that into account when we approve, whether it be a single home development or a now 19,000 unit. But we're certainly torn as there's a need for housing. And
well, I think that that when your chief says we've got to think different, I think that we have to have this sense, really, of a legitimate carrying capacity of what actually, and I had a guest who's a council person for many years in Marin, use that term on my show, so I don't feel like I'm completely using that phrase, like everybody's going to be offended by it, but it's been California's golden history to always be like doubling its population every 20 years. And this is sort of my thing. I think that a lot of our issues of our various crises of development and where we are on the planet, even if you want to talk about climate change, is when do we like say, all right, humans, we all got to like figure out how to back off a bit. I mean, right? And we do have to find that way. There's some kind of balance.
And I think we as fire officials are dealing with, now we are living climate change, where, for us, 23 years ago, I started with the department, Mark a little longer, Christie 30 plus in the federal agencies. And, people talk about climate change and that these major changes are coming, I think with sea level rise or other stuff, but we are living climate change today when it comes to the forest health and these fires that, previously were mega, new norm, all the rest of it. And, we now are looking at re-gearing completely how we approach and how aggressive we approach vegetation management, access and egress. And, right now our priority is, and we're putting in for some pretty big grants. I just signed some paperwork this week to really focus on our access and egress to make sure we can get people out. Where one of the major takeaways from Sonoma County, Paradise, these other events, is making sure that we have the notification system with multiple languages, the ability to get it out. What other technology can we embrace that's new to ensure that we can get people out? And then, really right after that is now we need to start reducing the vegetation in this county. And we're gonna have to make some pretty bold moves, and the public's gonna have to stand with us and support this. It's not gonna be inexpensive, but I think collectively if we do it together, it can be very reasonable and the results can be pretty significant.
It's thinking different. I mean, and it's on our table. It's like what we talk to our kids about when we try to gear them up as what they're supposed to be doing with their life and their generation. And of course, I mean, I can remember getting it when I was young. Oh, it's your generation. You're going to save the world. And it was like, should have been, I guess. But I thought too at that time in my way that, well, don't just shrug it off on your kids, or not shrug it, but be overly. The issue is with us, really. And to me, I'm going to throw one other thing in here, because it gives me the opportunity to, was this quote from it's on the front page of my collections here. And it's about a legal case that originated in Marin County back in the drought years of 1970s. Where did this take place here? If I can just, well, anyways, 1991. But in this Swanson versus, the building industry of Northern California versus Marin Municipal Water District. This is like a California Supreme Court decision. They said that the existing community had a greater right to be protected than anybody's speculative future use, and that there was a duty that the water district had at that time to stop issuing any more water permits. Now, I mean, there was a little caveat that said that this thing wasn't supposed to be used to stop developers in general, but I mean, it's interesting that this went into effect. People have forgotten about this, that there was a building moratorium in Marin County for a little while, and maybe, I don't know if it was extended beyond California, but I don't know. I think we're in crisis times in some level.
Similar. Certainly, I'm not a policymaker. I help our policymakers make decisions that protect us, and I think it's where you develop, how you do it, and a thoughtful process. And then, as we're talking about that, we're paralleling with protecting that existing infrastructure, homes that are already, we're in a built environment for the most part. I mean, I think in Marin, you're not going to see a lot of development. So the question is, how do we make what we have safer? And you add housing units, how do you do that creatively? And I think, the the benefit we have here in Marin is we have a very engaged community, very bright people, and I think together with our public agencies working on this, we can come up with solutions that serve us all well, and our children.
Well, geez, that sounds like a wrap, actually. What's the time here? Well, did I forget anything else here to add to our, the notes that we were hitting? How about the firefighters who many of them served for days, weeks? How are they doing? And what's going on? I mean, is it a major proportion of California firefighters or what?
Well, the last of our fire crews tomorrow is their last day for the TAM fire crew.
Of our seasonal firefighters.
Of our seasonal firefighters. And they are tired. They worked a really long summer, more hours than I think they wanted to. So folks are tired and ready to be done.
And our full-time staff as well. And it's not just, don't just think about the firefighters either. Think about the families back home.
Yeah.
My wife's saying is that she gets to share me with the rest of the state of California. And she has made comments like, I feel like a single mom during the summer, stuff like that. And it does weigh on you. And when you're on a fire for 2 weeks straight and then you get relieved, and then in order for us to staff back home, we're saying, you know what, guess what? You don't get to have days off. You need to work at the fire station in order for us to keep the stations covered.
My goodness.
So there is a tremendous impact, and so we've been working very hard for the traumatic events and focusing on the post-traumatic stress disorders and having debriefings and defusings to help them with that. But we've also been proactive with behavioral health so that they're not only physically healthy, they're mentally healthy going into the season, that so when they come out of it, they have a little bit more fuel in the tank.
But we definitely owe our firefighters a big thank you, and their families.
I think the people of California, and I think really the United States, and maybe it's spreading out through the world, maybe just from looking at what we've done, like going back to the 911 or whatever, but just the years of firefighting and our own interactions with you guys. You know, you're our heroes, really. I mean, I'm not trying to take away from any other organization, you know, for anybody's trying to do their jobs, let's put it this way. But there's something, you know, deeply and powerfully inspiring about the work that goes on regularly. And it's amazing. I saw one picture in my mind. I was up in Santa Rosa visiting a friend, and it was like 3 days or 2 days or whatever after the event. And there was guys at this mall, which is adjacent to where the fire was, you probably know where Larkfield area. And I was walking up to visit this friend who's in a retirement home. Luckily, it was spared. But the fire engine was there, and the guys were, you could just see the exhaustion, and there was a couple of families coming to meet them, giving them food, bags, and hugs, and little kids giving the firemen hugs. And I didn't know if those guys were just like, could get to see them for a minute, and then they were headed back up there or what. But I thought if I had a picture, that would be a.
No, it's been a tough 4 years, and I don't think it's going to stop. So we need to prepare for the sustainability of this, and that's the challenge.
Right.
But the good news is that, especially here in Marin, our firefighters are not going to give up, and we'll get there.
Yeah. Wow. All right. I want to thank you all for a educational, inspiring, excellent talk. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you,
Mark. Wonderful.
Thanks.
And Christy, thanks so much. All right. Thanks. Thank you, people of Marin and the world. All right. Cheers.